I would be disappointed if the Prime Minister does go to Ukraine. Firstly, because I don't see any positive results coming from this. And more importantly, because I think that it would be very damaging to India's current policy, correct policy in my view, of um, multilateral alignment and um, a, uh, uh, a, a tendency to make it clear that we stand on our own feet. I think the last thing we want is to look as if we are doing anything under pressure, because I think this would detract greatly from the policy that we've been following for the past few years.
In these circumstances, you've already said it would be a disappointment if the PM goes to Ukraine. It would look as if he's buckling under pressure. You can't see what traction there can be from such a visit. So does that mean that if Modi goes to Ukraine, it would be a mistake?
In my view, yes. For him to go personally himself would look as if, well, it'll be very difficult to avoid the conclusion that we are buckling under some kind of Western pressure. This will not be good for Indian foreign policy or our national interest in the long term.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. How do India's leading foreign policy experts view the possibility that Prime Minister Modi could visit Ukraine in August? And what would be the key purpose of that visit? That's the main issue that I shall raise today with India's former Foreign Secretary and former Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Krishnan Srinivasan. Mr. Srinivasan, 3 weeks ago on the 8th of July, when Prime Minister Modi visited Moscow at the same time as a major NATO summit in Washington and a Russian attack on a children's hospital in Ukraine, which killed 37, PTI says there was outrage in the West, and the Hindu says there was weeks of bitter criticism. So is the Prime Minister's visit to Kyiv, possibly on the 23rd or 24th of August, a response to this criticism? Is it an attempt to appease Western sentiment?
Well, I think to start with, we need to make a distinction between Prime Minister Modi's visit to Ukraine and the events that you've described, that is the Children's Hospital and the NATO summit. Because I think that these two events that took place are completely coincidental. As you know, the Prime Minister's visits to any country are planned weeks and months in advance. And once the date is fixed, it's not changeable. So the events that took place, the Children's Hospital, the NATO meeting, are entirely coincidental as far as Mr. Modi's visit is concerned. Then when it comes to the possible visit of the Prime Minister to Ukraine, I think that, well, that's still up in the air. We're not sure it will take place. Indian foreign policy has been extremely dexterous in navigating through a very difficult and turbulent time in world affairs. And I would be disappointed if the Prime Minister does go to Ukraine. Firstly, because I don't see any positive results coming from this. And more importantly, because I think that it would be very damaging to India's current policy, correct policy in my view, of multilateral alignment and a tendency to make it clear that we stand on our own feet. I think the last thing we want is to look as if we are doing anything under pressure, because I think this would detract greatly from the policy that we've been following for the past few years.
Let me clarify what you said. You said you would be very disappointed if the Prime Minister goes to Ukraine. You cannot see a positive outcome. Can you explain that further?
Well, I think that there are many ways in which Mr. Modi, if he wants to interact with the president of Ukraine, can do that in many multilateral fora, which he has done in the past. The United Nations General Assembly is coming up in a few weeks' time, which gives another opportunity. as far as positive results are concerned, I honestly do not see what traction there could be in a visit by the Prime Minister to Ukraine at the moment. I don't think that we have any magic formula to settle the Ukraine issue, the Ukraine war. And I don't think bilaterally there is much scope for greater improvement in Ukraine-India relations. I think that you know that total trade between Ukraine and India is around $2 billion. I can't see that being expanded much further.
So your advice to the Prime Minister as a former Foreign Secretary is don't go. Nothing can be gained from the visit at this moment.
Yes, that's true, particularly because it looks as if we're buckling to pressure. I think that any country that has aspirations to a world role should not be seen to be buckling under pressure. And secondly, I think that if there is a connection required with Ukraine, after all, we have full diplomatic relations. Somebody else could go to Ukraine if it's necessary to convey any kind of message, certainly not at the Prime Minister level. So I think that on the whole, I would say that it would be wise for the Prime Minister not to go to Ukraine at this time.
Let's take up on that sentence. It looks as if we're buckling under pressure. Many people would say India is buckling under pressure. The pressure from Washington has been both forceful and outspoken. Donald Lu, the Assistant Secretary of State, expressed America's disappointment and said Washington had had tough conversations with New Delhi. The State Department spokesperson said they had concerns about India's relationship with Russia. That's not the sort of language we're accustomed to hearing from Washington. Clearly, that is pressure, isn't it?
It is pressure, and I think it's very much the kind of language we are used to hearing from Washington. I think you'll remember that when there was this discussion or this allegation that India was responsible for an assassination attempt on a Khalistan supporter in New York, Mr. Panun, I think the same American official stated that some very hard and direct negotiations, discussions, conversations were taking place at the highest level with India, and they used expressions like repercussions and assurances. So I think this is very much the kind of language we're used to. And let's remember, though, that the Americans have a domestic constituency as well as any other country does. And many of these officials that appear before the Congress committees or whether speaking to the media are really playing to the domestic gallery in trying to show that America is a very tough negotiator and that the rest of the world tends to listen to what they say.
Let me put to you how the Indian spokesman defended the possible decision of Mr. Modi to go and how the American ambassador hit back pretty hard. The spokesman said India has freedom of choice. He spoke about India's strategic autonomy. But Eric Garcetti, the US ambassador, immediately said in times of conflict, there is no such thing as strategic autonomy, adding, America should not be taken for granted. Was that a sort of warning?
Well, it could be interpreted as such, but I think the American ambassador Garcetti needs to be informed about what the limits of his ambassadorial functions are. I think that, yes, perhaps he was within his rights in saying what he did, but it should not be done publicly through megaphone diplomacy. I think that's extremely unfortunate. I think that also, while the United States is important to India, undoubtedly, India is also important to the United States for multiple reasons. Big country, big population, big economy, very much a balancer in world affairs. If India tilts away from the United States, it will be greatly to the detriment of the United States. I think that someone perhaps should take Ambassador Garcetti aside and have a quiet word with him, because we don't indulge in megaphone diplomacy, that the Indian media is not to be used for criticism against the Indian government.
But let me put this to you. As you said, it looks as if India is buckling under pressure. Secondly, there is no doubt that there is strong pressure on India to do something. If visiting Ukraine is the wrong step for the Prime Minister to take, what would be the right response to the pressure the Prime Minister and the government face from the United States and the West in general?
Well, when we deal with a country like the United States, which has a global reach, global influence, and have very much their own distinctive view of the world, it is necessary to tread reasonably carefully. And yet I'll revert to the point that an India which aspires to a world role should not be um, accused, or let us say, uh, um, uh, it should not be yielding to any kind of pressure. And I think that if Mr. Modi goes to Ukraine, especially at that level, I think that that would precisely be what is implied. So I think that that should be ruled out. In terms of relations with the United States, when you deal with a country like that, you're always going to have a certain speed breakers, certain potholes, roadblocks. I mean, it's necessary to navigate all this. We have our own grievances with the United States, whether it's about trade tariff issues or immigration issues or WTO, GSP, a whole range of climate change, a whole range of issues, but it's necessary to deal with these in a more subtle way.
Tell me, was it a mistake on the part of the Prime Minister to go to Moscow on the 8th and 9th of July, given that 2 years had passed without a bilateral visit, given that he knew the West would be concerned, given that the war in Ukraine is continuing, would that visit have been a mistake?
No, I think not at all. I think our relations with Russia on a bilateral basis are pretty well trouble-free. I think it's been a long and time-tested relationship. The structural discussions between the Prime Minister of India and the President of Russia have been one of very long standing, and bilateralism definitely has been a feature of that, with bilateral visits to and fro. It is true that these have been interrupted in the past few years, but now I'm very happy that the momentum is being picked up again. And we cannot, I think I just have to revert to the point that we cannot allow our relations with third countries to be dictated by extraneous factors.
What about that bear hug? It's drawn a lot of comment, in particular from Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. He said, and I'm quoting him, "It is a huge disappointment and a devastating blow to peace efforts to see the leader of the world's largest democracy hug the world's most bloody criminal in Moscow on such a day." In other words, on the very day that a children's hospital was bombed by Russia and 37 were killed. Was it a mistake for Mr. Modi to be seen bear hugging Putin?
Well, I think that our Prime Minister is fairly accustomed to embracing his counterparts. I don't think that's anything very new. And I don't think it was a special gesture to the president of Russia necessarily. I will repeat that I think the events that took place in Ukraine were entirely coincidental with his visit. And I will say that I think the visit was very successful in many respects. And I don't see really any reason, again, I have to repeat that I don't see any reason why our relations with certain countries need to be dictated to, or their schedule affected by extraneous factors.
Let me ask you to pause at that moment and reflect upon Indo-US relations in the light of this development. What does this strong response, both from Donald Lu in Washington and Eric Garcetti in Delhi, tell us about the way America views India's relationship with Russia? Is it just an irritant, or is it becoming a bigger cause of concern? I refer both to India's refusal to criticize the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as the increasing reliance on Russian oil.
Well, this takes us back really many decades to the time of Secretary of State Foster Dulles. You may remember Eisenhower's foreign minister, who said that those who are not with us are against us. Big countries, particularly the United States with a global reach, tend to see countries as being for them or against them. I don't think we take such a view, a black and white view. Our view of the world is far more nuanced. And I think you're correct when you use the term strategic autonomy earlier. So I think that as far as the United States is concerned, let us remember that the United States leads the West. The West has a certain paranoia about Russia, which they've had actually for the last 130 years or so. And we do not share that. Also, let's remember that the West, US-led West, comprises about 10 or 11% of the world's population. And I would say that the rest of the world, that is 80 to 90%, do not share the Western view of the Russian and Ukraine conflict. They certainly do not subscribe to the rhetoric that is used by the Western leaders, particularly President Zelensky. And I would say that I'm very glad you mentioned or you hinted at the question of sanctions, because these sanctions, like oil, have been unilateral and of very doubtful legitimacy in international law. And they have caused enormous suffering to the rest of the world, the global south as it's now known, and in terms of food, fertilizer, supply chains, trade links. And I really think that it is time that countries or groups like the African Union or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or BRICS takes a stand against this, because it's motivated by the domination, the almost colonial style domination of financial instruments and means of
what you're saying,
currency
keep me
exchange.
interrupting you, but what you're saying is we should simply ignore the pressure from America and the West in terms of our relationship with Russia. It's got nothing to do with them. We are entitled to pursue the policy we want of our own volition, and therefore we should ignore whatever pressure we face from Washington in terms of our relationship with Russia.
Well, I think we can certainly take the views of every country and every group of countries into account. But in the end, Indian foreign policy has to be based on what is good for the Indian people and what is good for the Indian nation. And I think to be subject to collateral consequences through sanctions of very doubtful legitimacy, I think requires India to take a stand and take a stand with like-minded countries.
In these circumstances, you've already said it would be a disappointment if the PM goes to Ukraine. It would look as if he's buckling under pressure. You can't see what traction there can be from such a visit. So does that mean that if Modi goes to Ukraine, it would be a mistake?
In my view, yes. I think that we do have diplomatic relations. There's no reason why Mr. Modi, if he feels he has a message to send to the Ukraine authorities or people, cannot send somebody at a lower level. But for him to go personally himself would look as if, well, it'll be very difficult to avoid the conclusion that we are buckling under some kind of Western pressure. This will not be good for Indian foreign policy or our national interest in the long term.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Tell me, if he does go, and there is a big if there, what is the message he should carry for the Ukrainian government and people? This is not an era of war, is what he said to Putin when he first met him. When he met him 3 weeks ago, he said solutions cannot be found on the battlefield. But those were messages that would work with Moscow. What message would work with the people who've been invaded by Moscow?
Well, he could perhaps say that the questions of sovereignty and territorial integrity apply to all countries in the world, including those neighboring Ukraine, and that Russia has felt a tremendous threat to its sovereignty and territorial integrity from Ukraine since 2014 or thereabouts, due to several understandings which were either neglected or ignored or not implemented over that period. But I don't think he's going to say that, of course, though that's the reality. I think what he could say is that from present indications, it is not likely that Ukraine will win a war, and it is not likely that Russia is going to lose the war. Therefore, it is incumbent on both parties to find a solution.
Hang on a second. You're suggesting that he should hint to the Ukrainian people that surrender is an option, accept the reality, grit your teeth, and let Russia get away with what is captured.
No, let me try and finish what I was going to say. I think that he could say that it's time really for both parties to enter into bilateral negotiations without the use of any proxies, and perhaps it is time to dust off the Istanbul Agreement of 2022, which provided I doubt now whether the Russians would accept that formula, but that could perhaps be a starting point to get some bilateral negotiations going. Beyond that, I do not think there's much scope for any good offices or for India being an interlocutor at this present time.
If the message that Modi carries to Ukraine is, in effect, accept what's happened, negotiate now a peaceful outcome, that would certainly annoy the West hugely.
Well, I didn't say they should accept the outcome. What I said was they should start negotiations bilaterally with Russia in relatively good faith, making use of previous engagements like the one I mentioned in 2022, which might provide an opening for a settlement. Whether in the terms of that settlement, they will have to make some territorial and other concessions, that remains to be seen. I don't think that this issue can be prejudged, certainly by any third party outside Ukraine and Russia.
Aren't you assuming that Russia, in a negotiation process, might be willing to vacate the territory it's occupied in Donetsk and Luhansk? Which, by the way, it's formally incorporated into Russia as well.
That is right. But you know that it is, again, very difficult for an outsider to assess what might be the scope of the negotiations and their outcome. So let me leave it at this. I think that it is quite likely, to my mind, that Ukraine will have to make some concessions. It is quite likely that they will not be able to win this war. Therefore, I think that a ceasefire perhaps would be the first step, and a ceasefire could give some breathing space to proper negotiations held on a bilateral basis. We can't really prejudge the outcome of this. I think that Ukraine might well have to lose some territory, particularly in Donbass and particularly Crimea. But I think that it is not for me or anybody else who is outside Ukraine or Russia to describe the form of a final settlement.
If the visit takes the shape and form of a rebalancing, of an attempt to appease criticism in the West, which is what many believe the visit will do, that sort of visit probably won't sit well with President Putin, will it?
Yes, I think it wouldn't, but I think there's one very positive aspect of the Indian-Russian relationship, and that is that Russia has never commented, either publicly or privately, on India's relations with third countries, and nor has India privately or publicly commented on Russia's relations with third countries. And therefore, I think that this has led to a certain foundation of not only goodwill, but trust. And I would like to imagine that that will continue. So I don't see that there would be any repercussion, either privately or publicly, from Russia.
In other words, Russia would swallow whatever sentiment and ill feeling it has.
No, that's putting it a bit harshly. I think that Russia would certainly take note of India's relationships with third countries, as they do already, but they do not pronounce any judgment on these relationships, either publicly or privately.
My last question.
I think that's highly desirable.
My last question, if this is a balancing or rebalancing visit, one that you suspect is happening under what you call buckling under pressure, could India end up caught between two stools?
Well, I think to go back to the beginning, I hope the visit doesn't take place. I don't think that it should be a question of rebalancing, because it would look as if we're doing it under pressure. I don't think also that if in the unlikely event it takes place, it's a question of falling between two stools. In many ways, you could say that strategic autonomy means actually precisely being between two stools. But I think that in this particular case, I don't think it would be that, because I think that, as I said, I think Russia would be understanding, whatever their innermost thoughts might be on the subject. And I don't necessarily think that it would win any brownie points with the West either, frankly. I think they would also regard it, as many other people would, as India buckling under pressure. And I think that will not be good either in the short or long term for India.
So in a nutshell, do not go to Ukraine is your message to Mr. Modi. It would be a mistake. There can be no good outcome from that visit.
Yes, I would endorse that conclusion, with the small proviso that if there is any message to be conveyed to Ukraine, it could be done by somebody else at a lower level, but certainly not the Prime Minister.
Mr. Srinivasan, thank you very much for the time you've made available to me. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.